All right, all right. It's that time of the month that everyone is so excited for. That's right, the reading of the month. You could follow me on Twitter at Econ Ruminations. I really wanted to start getting into price and the price system and what that is, how it works. And there's a lot of confusion out there, especially if you look in, mainstream texts and all. I don't think the understanding that they put forward in, university and all that stuff is quite correct. I genuinely tend to prefer the Austrian take on this. And that has huge implications for, the theory that ends up, branching out as a consequence, you know. I think it's the foundational aspects of like how you understand prices that are really going to affect, what you think about policies, good and bad, business, and it just goes into so much more on the broader level that having a solid understanding at this level is very helpful. If you like this kind of stuff, find it enjoyable, please let me know. Let me know what I'm doing right. Let me know what I'm doing wrong. Like and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon for alerts. I'm still learning this. As a matter of fact, it's everybody's favorite, time of the month, as I said. But this is the first episode that I'm doing. So things will be messy. Let me know. Let me know where the garbage is so that I can take it out. Again, the book is Foundations of the Market Price System. It's by Milton M. Shapiro, 1985. Doesn't Nothing in here is expired, though. In fact, some of it, like I said, is more worthwhile to devote any of your attention to than the slime you'll learn in the mainstream. You can get this for free at Mises.org. Okay. If you go to Mises.org, I'll go to that page right here so you can see. This is their main page. If you click books and then you see featured books, these are the ones that came out. They have different categories to help you learn. For instance, Economy 101, you can start and work your way down. They have a lot of free stuff. I learned so much just from reading their material. That being said, as you feel you are getting a good understanding, I strongly recommend that you go outside of this little bastion. Okay. I honestly think that it really doesn't matter. Most people who seem to understand this will be fine doing that because, just because you read something doesn't mean you have to agree with it. Okay. And I think that the stuff you'll pick up here will actually, on a sound basis, on a reasonable basis, it'll hold its muster against much others. So, I'm not a fan of the, only read Rothbard or any of that kind of stuff. No, read everybody else. If you look through Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State, all he does is smash his critics, smash the theories that he found, wrong-headed, or muddle-headed, as Mises would say. And him as well as Mises, they freely and accurately and respectfully reference each one of the people that they're speaking, that they're countering. Each one of the arguments they're saying, this is where you can find it. This is what page. That's what you're supposed to do in writing. But just the sheer amount of specific references, like per sentence, etc., per point, it just shows you that they knew the literature. They knew their way around the debate. And that's the important thing. Because if you know your way around the debate, you'll be able to take in information, you'll be able to expel information, and you'll be able to do that in as intelligent a manner as possible for you. And you can practically pick up, bits and pieces that will help you because you will have a true understanding and therefore be able to spread it to areas outside of, just the theoretical. But that being said, that's the goal. The goal is to be able to say, hey, I really believe that this argument holds water and this one doesn't, and I can articulate why. That's what you want to be able to do. So whether you go to Mises.org and agree with some things they say or all things they say, or go to it and be like, that's trash, at least be able to articulate why. And and that's part of it is you'd have to read the other stuff as well. Okay, but this is a great place to start if you're looking to get a real good foundation so you can move on to smash that other stuff. You start here. If you look right under here, this is a quick way to do it. If you don't want to go there, you can either hit view all books or you can just go straight to the bottom here and you can start looking, by authors. I'm just going to hit view all books. And then you can quickly narrow it down. You can go to just EPUBs. EPUBs you can download. You can upload them to Google Books. You can put them on e-readers and things like that. If you have something like a ebook converter, you can convert them to Kindle files, etc. If you prefer to use PDFs, especially like on Mac, if you have markup and stuff like that, and you can write on the pages with the pen and all, these are great. You just go, you switch right over to PDF. You can undo EPUB too. Oh, let me see, PDF only. Okay, so well, you get the point. You can narrow down on what you want, and then once you find something, you just click it, and then it'll show you the options, in PDF, in Polish, in EPUB, and you can even buy it in print if you want it in print. But you can get the PDF version for free. You can scale through the whole thing. If you save it locally, you can even mark it up, add highlights, and do all that kind of stuff on most of these things. So that being said, again, you go to Mises.org, books, and then you're at this page. All right, so just definitely check them out. Okay, and I think that you're going to find yourself very, very happy to have done so. All right, so that being said, we're going to go back to the reading. Please like, subscribe, and add the bell icon. All right, so Foundations in the Market Price System by Milton Shapiro. All right, now the unfortunate thing about this book, and I'm going to skip over the table of contents, the preface, and all that stuff. I strongly recommend that you check them out, okay, because I think understanding. I think I went too far. Okay, yeah. So understanding that is very helpful. Now the unfortunate thing about this book is it's set in typewriter face, so it's not really a pleasure to look at. But let's start reading it. I'm going to do my best to be verbatim here. I apologize if I don't, if I drift this and that. If I have a thought to interject, I'll try it. But again, I'm not reading this book, at you. I want it to be more like something that we're reading and reasoning with together. All right, so let's, I guess, try it. Again, I have no idea how this is going to turn out. But chapter 1 is how people get by. So he starts off, he says, imagine, if you will, a community without a government, a stateless society in which no group has the legitimate power to coerce other individuals or interfere into peaceful voluntary exchange. In other words, imagine a world without taxation, without conscription, without government regulation of prices, rents, and wages, without government regulation of production and trade, without government redistribution of income and wealth, and so on. So, in this imaginary world, let's raise the basic question. Well, how can a person get by? That is, how can a person acquire the material goods and services that he or she wants, the goods that enable a person to survive and prosper? All right, so I'm just going to take a quick break and just before everybody gets offended and all that kind of stuff, keep in mind he's saying it's an imaginary world. And the reason you're doing this is because you're going to start to learn how to reason in a logical fashion. Okay. So let's just take it for what it is and just move forward. So, 1, how individuals get by. So, the simplest way to answer the question, how can a person get by, is to imagine each of us in a Robinson Crusoe, or that is, an isolated person living and working alone, in the bosom of nature. So, it's just you're in nature all by yourself. For Crusoe, it is obvious that his ability to enjoy the world's goods, that's to consume its fruits, vegetables, grains, and other goods made from its resources, depends primarily on his own productive efforts. So his ability to get the satisfaction of something made is to, in fact, go ahead and produce that. So if I'm hungry, I got to go find something to eat. If I'm cold, I got to find something to drape around my body, etc., etc., etc. So clearly, to continue, clearly Crusoe's fortunes depend on his own efforts and ingenuity in exploiting the resources of nature. He cannot depend on anyone else but himself. There is no one else from whom he could beg, borrow, or steal from in time of need. If he ever falls upon bad times for reasons of poor health or bad weather, he would have no one but himself to depend on. So, how Crusoe gets by? Well, initially, of course, Crusoe could get by simply scavenging the resources of nature, gathering wild fruit and grain, hunting wild animals, catching fish. And to increase his productivity as a scavenger, he would have to create and use simple or crude handmade tools and weapons. And after a while, having exhausted the resources of a given locale, he would have to move on to search for new fruitful locations. And if he ever runs out of exploitable locales or decides to give up his migrations and settle down in a given locale, he would have to learn how to cultivate artificially what nature produces naturally. Thus, for Crusoe, it is clear that as a scavenger, hunter, or farmer, he can only get by through his own work or productive efforts. Now, how does this imaginary Crusoe model apply to the real world? A world in which people live not as isolated individuals, but as members of society, in which multitudes of individuals cooperate in production and trade in one way or another. How does a person get by in the context of society? How would Crusoe get himself, how would Crusoe himself rather get by if in his migrations he stumbles upon a strange community? How would Crusoe's options, his choices, how would they be affected? Would he still have to rely, purely on his own labor? What alternatives would he have to working and producing for himself the goods that he wants? What if for some reason he couldn't work or he didn't want to work? And that brings us to getting by in society. So initially, of course, Crusoe in society could continue to work out of habit ingrained during the existence of isolation. However, in a society, he would discover opportunities to specialize. Okay. And that would mean really to concentrate on the production of a single product or service rather than pursue the, jack of all trades approach that he had in the past. And when he himself had to produce many of the different things that he wanted. Instead, now he finds that he can concentrate on being, let's say only a farmer or only a carpenter or only a builder or only a fisherman and live as well as, if not better than, when he was formerly in the days of isolation, trying to do all these things at once. I can fish for 2 hours a day, but if I don't catch anything, I'm kind of screwed. I can try and work on the house, but I only have a couple hours a days of light for that. If I want to start planting something and tilling the soil, I got to clear the way, I got to prepare the soil, et cetera, et cetera. You're not really going to get far. So the advantages of living and working in a social economy based on specialization and division of labor, we're going to get into that. That's detailed in chapter 3, but there's something that's very clearly being illustrated here. So to continue, in time, however, Crusoe would begin to discover that his new social existence as a member of society, that affords him with new opportunities of getting by. All right? Opportunities that were not available to him in his days of isolation. For one thing, he would observe that some people in times of personal distress or enhanced need were able to get by through, begging for handouts or even from charity of others or by receiving gifts or inheritances. Still, others, he would notice, were able to get through by borrowing money from moneylenders or banks. And finally, he'd also discover that some people were getting by on theft. And that was by forcefully taking from others. Okay, I see you there. I know that you've produced something. I'm going to take it. And most important of all, Crusoe would also realize that all of these new opportunities to get by through begging, through borrowing, and stealing were all the consequence of the fact that in society, a person is no longer just a Crusoe, having to get by purely on his own resources. So, beg, borrow, or steal. And this brings us back to the original question. How can a person get by? So in the case of isolated Crusoe, it's clear that the only ultimate principle of getting by is the principle of work and production. In isolation, Crusoe has no one but himself to depend on. And that's to make the things that he wants, whether he's in health and strength or whether he's in distress and weakness. But in society, it is a very different matter. The individual can at times resort to other ways of getting by, such as receiving gifts or handouts, borrowing money or other goods, or stealing from others. Okay? Obviously, none of these resources are available to Crusoe just, living in isolation. And such are the advantages of living in society. It becomes possible to depend on others in order to get by. Okay? So, and remember, there's begging, borrowing, or stealing. Okay? So, at core, there's 3 important concepts going on there, and I'm sure we're going to get into that. You'll see. Just to give a little bit of a spoiler, begging or gifts voluntary exchange, which you could also say is the same thing as if I trade you my tie for your pen and you your tie for my pen, because each prefers the other more than the other, but we're not making any decisions about value. So that's one thing. So voluntary exchange, the passing of goods through agreement. Then the next would be borrowing. Okay, well, I'm going to give you this, whether it's money or a good or whatever, in the anticipation that you are going to return it and that I, in fact, do so, which can lead us to the third option as one of the ways. But we can not pay that back and just say I'm reneging on my contract and thus, I falsified my intentions to you. I lied. And that's stealing because now I have the resource you don't. And that wasn't exactly voluntary. Or the forceful, appropriation of said resources, whether it's money or anything else. That's stealing. So when you're dealing with humans in society, there's only three ways through which things can, take place, or two at base, which is voluntary exchange or gift, and theft. Within the middle, this gray area where okay, I'm going to let you borrow it, but you got to give it back, and I don't know you will until you actually do so. So, but none of that's possible again outside of society. Okay. So, at first glance, it seems that the answer to our original question, that a person must work or produce in order to get by, no longer applies when a person lives in society. But this would be a pretty dumb conclusion, and that's based on the fallacy of consumption. The notion that what is true for the individual would also be true for society as a whole. And we're going to get into that now with the fallacy of consumption. So, it's true that in society, some people can occasionally resort to the principle of beg, borrow, or steal in order to get by. But in no way, a society as a whole, each and every one of us, resort to the principle of beg, borrow, or steal at all times without anyone engaging in production. That is, it should be self evident that unless some people do the work that yields useful goods and services, it is impossible, important word, impossible for anyone else to do any begging, borrowing, or even stealing. And the truism can be easily spelled out. Someone must have produced the goods and wealth that others are able to receive as personal gifts, charity, or donation. Even the sons or daughters who inherit a fortune from rich parents and therefore don't have to work the rest of their lives, they're merely the benefactors of wealth produced by their parents or ancestors, etc. Similarly, in the case of borrowing is possible only as long as there are lenders who themselves must have worked and saved to accumulate the funds they lend to the borrowers. All right. We're not going to get into central banking and money printing and all that just yet. We're looking at philosophically, theoretically, what's going on underneath the surface so that we can understand practically in the real world, what these things could lead to or what they mean or what they're showing us is actually happening. So we're using theory to understand what's going on currently and historically. So the only difference here with borrowing is that the borrower will also have to work in order to pay back the loan. Okay, so let's look at work, production, and exchange. Take a quick sip. So he goes on. He says the same reasoning applies to the principle of getting by on stealing. Clearly, there is no future for the thief or robber if there are no victims to steal from. That is, if there are no goods or wealth produced by others which he can convert forcibly, and seize from their productive and rightful owners. So, indeed, in all of these cases, in receiving gifts, borrowing, and stealing, the great extent to which people have utilized these resources is eloquent testimony to the great amount of income and wealth that others have produced and made available for charity and lending, fortunately, as well as for theft and robbery, unfortunately. So, economics therefore concludes that the only basic principle by which a community or society can get by is the principle of productive work. The more economically productive is a community, the more it is able to sustain those individuals who occasionally resort to the principle of beg, borrow, or steal. Related to the principle of production, however, is the principle of free and voluntary exchange. Okay, and this is also the foundation of beg and borrow. So, but voluntary exchange, which is characteristically relevant to the social economy, in contrast to the isolated man Crusoe economy. And as we're going to see when we get to chapters 3 and 4, production in the modern social economy involves highly developed system of specialization and division of labor. On the other hand, and free trade and exchange on the other. All right. So in the present context, it is correct to say that in the social economy, free and voluntary exchange is as important a way of getting by as is production. This principle of getting by on productive and voluntary exchange has been dubbed by the German sociologist Franz Oppenheimer as the economic means. Okay. Again, the principle of getting by on production and voluntary exchange has been dubbed by German sociologist Franz Oppenheimer as the economic means. And that was in the book The State, just in case anyone's interested. Great book. You can get that on Mises.org for free. So we're going to get into a little bit of a digression on theft and counterfeiting, which we alluded to because, ideas pop in your head about these central banks and money printing and all that. So he continues. He says, before we proceed, let's clarify some questions that might have occurred to the reader. The above analysis may give the impression that stealing itself involves no work. Strictly speaking, we should have used only the word production and avoided the word work, which we used loosely and interchangeably with the word production. In economics, production refers specifically to the creation of useful goods and services, whereas work is used in the more general sense of activity. And in chapter 5, there's more details on production, or chapter 4, rather. By these definitions, the thief clearly engages in work, but in no sense are they being an economically productive agent, the creator of the goods that they've stolen. Nor is the person who gets by as a counterfeiter, for instance, of money in any sense a productive agent. To be sure, there is no little work involved, rather, in counterfeiting, Uncle Sam's crisp greenbacks, but in no way can such creation be regarded the same as creating, let's say, the bread, the cloth, or the machinery that arise from productive activities. And furthermore, counterfeiting cannot serve as a universal principle of getting by. If all of us, for instance, worked at creating and passing out phony money, and no one worked producing anything, nobody made shirts, shoes, clothes, cars, roads, food, material, etc. We all just made money. There would be nothing to buy with the phony money, and really no point then to counterfeiting in the first place. So that would just continue there. So indeed, what makes counterfeiting, sensible and successful is the ability to carry off the deception that's involved and to make the producers and the retailers unaware of the counterfeit nature of the money that they received, and therefore deceive them into believing that, let's say, all the dollars in circulation are exactly alike in legitimacy. That is, if the sellers of goods and services knew in advance that all the money was counterfeit, they'd simply refuse to accept it. So that's why confidence, for instance, is so important. So this brings us now to start to question something else here. How does the government get by? So let's forget about the imaginary stateless society, a world without government, and let's see what difference the existence of government makes, at least as far as economic production and exchange are concerned. Now, admittingly, a full-length detailed analysis of government and its role in the economy transcends the scope of this type of introductory book. Instead, read Man, Economy, and the State for that. Instead, and Power and Market, we will confine our analysis to the essentials. And since these essentials are relatively few and well known, we can proceed to analyze the role of government in the economy within the same fundamental framework that we used in the preceding discussion. Thus, we can start with our basic simple question. Well, how does the government get by? How do elected politicians and appointed government officials secure the public goods and services that they provide to the citizens? How do they obtain the resources required to provide the public with education, defense, police, welfare, and other services? And if we apply the same framework of analysis that was applied above to Crusoe and other individuals, it's really not difficult to come up with some pertinent answers. So we got to first address the legal monopoly of coercion. So first and foremost, government. Let me plug this back in. Okay. So first and foremost, government throughout history have all had the same unique privilege, and that's the legal monopoly power, only they're allowed to do it, to exercise physical force or coercion over an individual. So, under this monopoly privilege of coercive powers, governments have been able to implement systems of taxation, conscription, expropriation, and eminent domain as prime means of obtaining command over resources and wealth. And although under these monetary monopoly powers, rather, governments also exercise controls over production and trade by means of quotas, licensing, prohibition, and redistribute income and wealth by taxation and subsidies, or transfer payments, as they're called in mainstream university. It is primarily the power to tax, to conscript, and expropriate that really enables governments to get by. The legal power to coerce citizens in these ways is truly a monopoly privilege that has been arrogated by all governments and denied to the individual. They can do it, but we can't. And in society, no private individual can legally, all right, can legally acquire goods or wealth from others except through the means of voluntary exchange of goods or services provided by them or received by them as a gift or in a prior, exchange transaction. So that is, it would be completely illegal, i.e., criminal, for a person to go and directly seize another person's property by force and against their voluntary consent. You know, and this is not so the case in governments. They can legally do what for the individual would be an illegal or criminal activity. Specifically to that point, governments can command resources for disposal by means of such forcible actions as taxation, conscription, and expropriation. They can just, via edict, declare that they're going to take 30% of your income, and you're supposedly agreeing to it just because you're there, which is a separate discussion. But in the pure sense of what's going on economically, it's important to understand that distinction. Franz Oppenheimer, who wrote The State and called the other means, the voluntary exchange and productive means, he called that, the economic means. He gave a name to this special way of getting by, and he called it the political means. So, and this was, again, in contrast to the economic means of free production and exchange. And for Oppenheimer, the economic means and the political means have been the only basic principles of getting by in all of human history. And that's a particularly important insight. So the political means versus the economic means, that's where that brings us. They continue. He continues. He says, all of this brings us to a crucial question. Is it possible for society to survive and prosper purely by the government principle of political means? Clearly, the answer is no. Governments can only get by, by forcibly appropriating the resources and productivity provided by the society or the social economy under the principle of the economic means. So they can only tax, they can only take, and they can only, redistribute and transfer. So all of the tax powers in the world would not enable any government to exist if there was no private income, no private wealth that they could apply the tax to. Income and wealth earned through the economic means of production and exchange. Unless there was wealth being generated, productive wealth being generated in society, they couldn't, sift any off the top. And the conclusion there is obvious. So, as a principle of getting by, the economic means comes prior and therefore is superior to the political means. Okay, because you cannot have one without the other. You can't have the political means without the economic means, but you can, in fact, have the economic means without the political means. How messy it is, that's the discussion that people often, get involved in. He continues, he says, a brief digression. The reader may have noticed an important omission in our catalog of political means. Governments today get by not only by taxation, but also by deficit financing, by borrowing from the public and the banks in order to finance expenditures in excess of tax revenues. That's clearly pertinent in what's going on right now for the 50 millionth debt ceiling, debate and rise. So clearly, such deficit financing has become a hallmark of advanced countries throughout the world. Remember, this is 1985, and a basic method of getting by for government. Nevertheless, government's ability to borrow from the public and banks in order to finance deficits is vitally related to its power to tax. On the one hand, government can borrow from lenders only so long as it is able to pay them interest on the securities or debt it sells to them. Otherwise, why would I give you my money? On the other hand, government is able to pay interest on its debt simply by taxing the public to finance these interest payments. It follows, therefore, that government's ability to finance deficits is vitally dependent on its power to tax. Now, again, this was written in 1985. There's a bit of nuance there, since this writing, but I think at the core it still holds true. The author would have just probably thought that by now they wouldn't be able to keep this going, but as you learn with Eurodollar and the interconnectivity of international central banks, you really start to look at the thing in a more broad sense than just individual nation by nation. But that's another thing too. So he concludes the chapter. He says the purpose of this chapter has been primarily introductory. The basic conclusion is that man must work and produce in order to create the goods and services that can satisfy his wants. In essence, however, there is nothing novel here. We knew this at the very start. Nevertheless, the discussion has cleared away some underbrush that enables us to get to the ultimately basic question in economics. Why does man have to work and produce in the first place? Why can't man find the things that he wants ready made without having to produce them? And the answer to this central question is the subject of the next chapter or next video on scarcity, which is the basic economic problem. So again, please like and subscribe if you found this helpful. Let me know again what I did right, what I did wrong. Follow me on Twitter at Econ Ruminations. This has been the reading of the month, and we have been reading Foundations of the Market Price System by Milton M. Shapiro. And once again, you can get that by going to Mises.org and then going to their books section and looking through the books where you can download whatever you want. It's a cornucopia. It's amazing. So do that. I hope this was good, and I'll see you when we get to chapter 2.